The Earth, seen from Apollo 16. Its beauty left the astronauts groping for words. But for most of us, this view from space is something we'll only ever see on films or photographs. What we actually experience more and more is the ugliness which 20th century civilization has brought to life on this planet. The ugliness in the developed world of pollution and the ugliness in the underdeveloped world of hunger and deprivation. The problems involved in man's use and abuse of his world and its resources have been accelerating so rapidly over the last few decades that few national leaders or decision makers can afford to ignore them any longer. A worldwide conference on the environment has now been called by the United Nations. 1,200 delegates from 130 member nations will spend 11 days in Stockholm trying to find some positive answers to problems which, in the eyes of some experts at least, are rapidly becoming insoluble. Any delegate who wants to see the problems at first hand will not have to move very far from the conference hall. Sweden is one of the most pollution-conscious nations in Europe. It's even thought that Swedish anti-pollution legislation could serve as a model for the sort of international charter that the UN hopes to hammer out at the conference. And by most standards, Stockholm is a clean, smoothly functioning capital. But even here, cleanliness is purely relative. Pollution from chimney stacks is only one aspect of the problem. Stockholm, like every other city in the world, is under the curse of the automobile. The world's car makers put 23 million new vehicles on the road every year. All of them use the internal combustion engine. All of them pollute the atmosphere. Some progress has already been made in cleaning up exhaust gases, and research is going on into alternative engines powered by steam or electricity. But new developments take time and money, and meanwhile the world is going to start the next decade with well over 400 million cars on its roads, roads which are going to swallow up increasing amounts of land which might otherwise be used for building or farming. Two years ago, this motorway was driven through London's western suburbs, vastly improving access to the city centre. The cost was £33 million sterling for the 2.5-mile stretch. But the true price is still being paid in terms of lost housing and the deterioration of the areas which lie in the motorway's shadow. Living conditions in most of the world's major cities have been getting steadily worse, and it needs only one breakdown, like a garbage strike, to make them well-nigh intolerable. Developed countries especially produce fantastic amounts of rubbish. Britain alone produces 20 million tons a year, nearly a third of a ton for every man, woman and child in the country. And the problem's not confined to domestic refuse. Toxic waste from industry is a growing hazard, and tougher legislation is going to be needed both on the national and the international level. The Stockholm Conference hopes to be able to make a start on this. Polluted land is bad enough, but polluted water is even worse because the problem doesn't remain localized. These are the famous cascades at Tivoli in Italy, but barely 100 yards away is another cascade, poisonous effluent from a local paper mill. Italy has 8,000 towns and only 80 sewage works, and so enormous amounts of effluent, both industrial and domestic, goes into the waterways untreated. Many rivers, including the River Tiber, are turned into open sewers. The trouble is, water is generally so scarce that even water as polluted as this is going to have to be reused by somebody. When the water reaches the Mediterranean, the problem doesn't disappear, it merely changes. Some Italian beaches are among the foulest in Europe, with up to 10 times the acceptable level of organic bacterial pollution. And with 17 other nations all polluting it in varying degrees, the Mediterranean itself is in danger. From an Italian beach to a Japanese one. Half a world between them, but the problem's the same. This is Enoshima Beach, less than 40 miles from Tokyo. Its gentle slope makes it ideal for children, except that the water is filthy with industrial sewage and the sand is impregnated with oily sludge. According to one United Nations report, which will be studied at the Stockholm conference, the world is going to run out of water within a century, and there'll be serious worldwide shortages in only 30 years. Experts agree that action will have to be taken very quickly if this prophecy of doom is to be avoided. The practices which have turned rivers like the Rhine into scum-covered sewers will have to be abandoned, but there's serious doubt whether this can be done in time. A Russian report to the conference states that by the end of the century, even if all wastewater were purified twice as much as it now is, it would still take the whole of the Soviet Union's river flow to dilute it. Ecologists are frequently accused of being prophets of doom, but there are some places on Earth which are already visible proof of their worst fears. Knapsack in Western Germany is one of them. Knapsack's misfortune is to be next door to massive deposits of brown coal, which have been attracting industry to the area ever since the beginning of the century. Today, Knapsack is surrounded on 3 sides by a spectacular forest of chimneys, each one belching its particular blend of poisonous gases. Anyone who doesn't believe that industrial pollution can make normal living impossible has only to come to Knapsack to see for himself. The town lives in a perpetual swirl of steam and smoke, which is often so thick that street lighting is needed even in the daytime. Bad as the situation is now, it's 5 times better than it was during the 1950s. Since then, Knapsack industrialists have spent huge sums on attempts to curb pollution. One firm alone has spent £5 million, but it's all been in vain, for after years of trying to accept the unacceptable, the residents have finally admitted defeat. They've sold their houses to the council and they're moving out, all of them. The worst of it is, Knapsack is not even unique. Similar conditions, sometimes even worse, can be found elsewhere in Germany and in other developed countries. In the United States, the Four Corners mine is part of a gigantic industrial complex that will eventually contain 6 of America's largest coal-fired power stations. It's a perfect example of how orthodox theories about economic growth can, in practice, be self-defeating. In economic terms, Four Corners is a success, feeding 14,000 megawatts of cheap electricity into the national power network. But environmentally, it's a disaster. It's been called the worst single source of pollution in America, belching out 350 tons of soot and ash a day into the formerly unpolluted air of the New Mexico desert. That's more than New York and Los Angeles combined. Pollution on this scale is bad enough, but the deeper implications of schemes like Four Corners are even worse. Many experts are now convinced that the wholesale plundering of the Earth's mineral resources to satisfy bigger and bigger demands for energy from an increasingly urbanized society is a certain recipe for catastrophe. At the present rate of exploitation, most of the known reserves of minerals and fossil fuels will be exhausted within 100 years, though coal may last a little longer. And the argument that by that time we can all rely on nuclear energy doesn't hold up either. The difficulties of disposing of radioactive wastes, even at their present small levels, are bad enough. And a massive development of nuclear energy may simply mean exchanging one set of ecological problems for another. The only answer to the energy problem is to use less of it. And since energy is the very lifeblood of our industrialized society, it follows that any curtailment of its use must restrict the expansion of society. And some environmentalists are now saying that we'll have to abandon our long-held dogmas of continuous economic growth and material expansion in order to conserve those resources essential to our survival. It's frequently suggested that the oceans of the world will continue to sustain man even when land-based resources have run out. An optimistic view, but with little evidence to sustain it. With the coming of factory fleets which can stay out of port for weeks at a time, many of the world's fishing grounds have been grossly overfished. To make matters worse, the growing quantity of industrial pollutants flowing into the sea is inexorably destroying the plankton on which the fish feed, a development that shows how the different elements that make up the environment are, in fact, closely interrelated. In agriculture, too, the use of intensive methods have solved some problems and created others. In the developed nations, most people's diet includes a high proportion of animal protein, mainly from meat and dairy products. In order to satisfy this demand, farmers have adopted intensive feeding methods for their animals using vegetable protein extracts, often imported from the underdeveloped parts of the world. This situation, say the conservationists, is a clear waste of resources. Man should be consuming the vegetable protein directly, without waiting for it to be converted by an animal. If he did so, he would be cutting out an unnecessary link in the food chain, and would thus enable the resources now used to produce food for animals to be transferred to producing food for millions of hungry people in the poorer parts of the world. What all this means in practical terms is that the Englishman will have to give up his lamb chops, the American his beef steak, and the German his sausages, in order to redress the balance in favor of Africans, Indians, and Latin Americans. So far, there's no evidence that they'll be willing to do so, for what appears to be the academic arguments of ecologists. Even if they did, their gesture would be futile without some effective attack on the greatest threat of all to man, the sheer number of his own species. There are now 3,600 million people in the world, and that number increases by 8,000 every hour. This means that the world's population will double by the end of the century, and double again by the year 2040. Few ecologists would agree that the world could support 4 times its present population, but even if it could, then on present trends that number too would double in less than 40 years. Statistics can be confusing, but what the population explosion comes down to is this. If the rate of increase does not slow down, then in 5 centuries' time, there will simply not be enough room for everybody to sit down on the face of the Earth. But quite apart from the dangers of future growth, there are problems enough to contend with for the present population, 2/3 of whom are already inadequately fed. famine is not just something that happens because of sudden disruptions in society, such as natural disasters like drought or flood. These children, it's true, were filmed because they were victims of a savage civil war in Nigeria. But there are hundreds of millions of others for whom starvation is a way of life. And for at least 10 million a year, it's a way of death, too. That's equivalent to the population of Belgium wiped out every year because there is simply not enough to eat. All ecologists agree that the growth in population has to be curbed, and only the heartless would suggest that this should be achieved through starvation. National programs of contraception seem to offer the only possible solution. Some experts have also argued that the world economic system will have to be radically restructured to prevent the rich nations getting richer and the poor poorer. Another, more optimistic school of thought believes that part of the answer to world hunger may come from this: new strains of high-yield cereals on which the so-called Green Revolution has been based. In the last decade, these new crops have achieved remarkable results in several parts of the world, often doubling and even tripling previous yields. They're adapted to flourish in poor soils and dry climates where normal crops would stand little chance. Their disadvantages are that they demand enormous quantities of fertilizer, and they often need the protection of pesticides, both of which are usually beyond the pocket of the peasant farmer whom the crops are primarily designed to help. Even so, Professor Norman Borlaug, the man mainly responsible for their development, was honored 2 years ago when he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his work. Borlaug is an optimist among ecologists. He believes the Green Revolution will work if it's given a chance, but not if ill-informed conservationists succeed in banning pesticides as part of their campaign against pollution.
Well, of course, if there was a complete ban on pesticides, this goal could not be realized because they are one of the vital factors involved in cereal production. And you see, if you also expand this term, as I have sometimes, not necessarily the term pesticides, but I have been sort of frightened by some of the press releases that I've seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, where not only are pesticides condemned and criticized, but even fertilizer. Now, if we say that pesticides and fertilizers cannot be used, well, then we can simply say we can't produce enough food. The people, the world, must decide that either we use agricultural chemicals and use them wisely, the right amounts, the right kinds, to produce the food we need, or we will all starve. There has to be common sense involved in the application and all of this use of chemicals in agriculture. It's not only pesticides, I think it's all a part of this global concern for our environment. It has to do with smog, it has to do with many different aspects. And I think we have to look at all of these critically. And we need to build in safeguards. But I don't think that we have been abusive in most cases in the use of insecticides in the past. In a country such as the USA, which has vast areas of land that have been taken out of production because of the farm policy, our efficiency of our American farmers, which are so much greater than any other farmers in the world. One farmer can produce enough food for something on the order now of 33 people. But in a large part, this comes from his wise use of chemical fertilizer and pesticides. And the U.S., because it now has in reserve a large area of uncultivated land, because of trying to reduce the overproduction, as it were, could go back and conceivably, for a short period of time with the use of legumes and rotations, produce a large quantity of food with great reductions in the case of fertilizer. Not referring now to pesticides. But most countries of the world do not have these land resources. A small farmer has 2 to 5 acres of land. Are you to deny, not you, but are we, the American people, and pretty largely what we do in the United States will be copied elsewhere, because this is the way the world works. Are we to deny this small farmer that depends from these small pieces of lands the opportunity now when he is finally finding out how to use chemical fertilizers, chemical pesticides to increase his production, to go back to this starvation diet?
Even Borlaug himself admits that the Green Revolution is not a panacea. He realizes that as population keeps increasing, not even the miracle yields he's made possible will produce enough food to keep pace. What the Green Revolution will do, he says, is give the world another 30 years, a breathing space in which to find permanent answers to the problems of feeding the hungry millions. If the solutions are not found and applied by then there may be little that science or technology can do to improve the situation. But some ecologists believe that even if we get the 30 years Borlaug talks about, it'll make no difference in the long run. One of these is Professor Paul Ehrlich of California's Stanford University, who's long been preaching the most pessimistic message among environmentalists.
Let's assume for a moment that we have that kind of luck and that the Green Revolution will keep food production up per capita with population growth until the year 2000. Now, one of the things you should do is consider what that means. Over the last 30 or 35 years, per capita food production has stayed about even. In other words, we've managed to increase agricultural production at about the same rate as the population has grown, and so everybody's piece of the pie has been about the same size. What it means is that 35 years ago, there was something on the order, say, of a little over 1 billion people living on an inadequate diet in the underdeveloped countries. Now we have something over 2 billion people living on an inadequate diet in the underdeveloped countries. If we should manage to keep today's level per capita up until the end of the century, we'll have something over 4 billion people living on inadequate diets in the underdeveloped countries. In other words, the principle here is spread the misery. The more people you can have living in misery, as long as you keep that minimal level of misery up, you're all right. Well, let's suppose that we're going to be successful in spreading the misery and we're going to be able to have a little over 4, maybe 5 billion people living on inadequate diets in the year 2000, by which time we will have had to achieve population control. Well, I wish I could say it could be done, but by any rational standard, it is impossible to halt human population growth by the year 2000. I would refer you to an article by Nathan Kieftz, perhaps the outstanding demographer in the United States, in Demography last spring, when he did a very interesting calculation. He asked the question, what would happen if in the next 30 years the net reproductive rate in the underdeveloped countries dropped to 1? What that means is what would happen if we had a birth control miracle, a contraceptive, a population control miracle in the next 30 years, and all the people in the underdeveloped countries started reproducing just at replacement level. That means in a country like India, the average desired family size dropped from, say, 5.5 to 2.5. Something that is not anticipated, as far as I know, by any demographer in the world or by any UN agency or by any governmental agency. In other words, this is an incredible miracle. Well, if that miracle should be achieved, population growth in the underdeveloped countries will continue to well past the middle of the next century, and the average underdeveloped country will finish up with a population size that is 2.5 times its present size. That is, with a population control miracle, you will end up with well over 1 billion Indians, something on the order of 1.3 billion Indians. Which gets me to the basic message, and it's the same one I give audiences in the United States. In a democracy, I think the answer to this problem doesn't lie necessarily in lots more scientific research, although God knows we need that, and so on. We really know the directions we have to move. We don't know all the answers, but we know the kinds of things that have to be done. We have to move towards population control. We have to limit our resource use as hard as we can. We have to redistribute wealth. We have to start to treat the environment with some love and respect and so on. You all know various aspects of things that have to be done. It's not enough to put bricks in your toilet to save water or recycle your tin cans ritually or so on. What needs to be done is that society has to take action corporately, because the problems are too big to be tackled by individuals and have success. Not that the individual efforts don't help, but you've really got to act corporately, and that means politics.
Political action is what's needed, but will the Stockholm Conference provide it? As they walk to the conference hall, the delegates will pass these elm trees, which are still standing thanks to the vigorous action of conservation groups who refuse to see them destroyed to make way for a new subway. Politicians in Sweden, as in other industrialized nations, are under increasing pressure to include conservationism in their declared policies. But what's needed is a global awareness of the urgency of the situation. It's not necessary to share the pessimism of the gloomiest ecologists in order to see that something must be done, and done quickly, if the Earth is to remain the sort of place where human beings will want to live. It's the cities that'll feel the pressures first. 10 years ago, people living in cities were outnumbered 2 to 1 by people living in country areas. But by the year 2000, there'll be more people living in cities than outside them. What we now have to imagine is, what will those cities be like? How much breathable air will there be? How much open space? How many flowers for these children's children to pick? Many well-informed people, including ecologists, believe that doomsday is not around the corner and that technology will solve the problems that technology has created. They point out that 15 years ago, few people believed that man would ever walk on the moon. That impossibility has now been achieved, and the astronauts have become heroes of our scientific age. But perhaps they should also be symbols, for man on the moon can only survive with adequate food, water, and oxygen. The painfully obvious lesson we have to learn is that the same is true of man on Earth.